My passion for studying democracy and public participation in democracy has a whole bunch of different origins, but there's two simple threads. One is it was epigenetics from my parents. My dad ran for Congress in 1976 quite unsuccessfully. Send a scientist to conference was not a winning message. My mom then ran in 1992 with not quite as spectacular a failure, but in both cases, it was exciting and really connected me. In my mom's case, I actually ran the campaign towards the end and got bit by the campaign management bug. On the other hand, they tried their best to raise me Quaker. And that gave me a very different sensibility. Campaigns and elections are all about winning and losing. And the Quaker approach to decision-making is, as many know, more consensus-based and very much about the quality of dialogue among people. And so those two influences kind of dovetail in what my career has been, which is studying democracy with an emphasis on American politics, but looking for ways in which our political system is deficient, not only structurally in the most fundamental sense, but also in terms of the quality of talk. So the purpose of my comments today, this Quaker ex-campaign manager brings to you a little bit of a maybe broader conception of what democracy is and how civic engagement fits in. We use those terms all the time, but I try to step back and think about just 5 criteria for democracy. This comes from initially the work of Robert Dahl, and I'll adapt his 5 criteria only slightly. But hopefully it'll give you a sense of civic engagement that's a little wider, and it might influence what kinds of metrics you're interested in. The slides have some references that might give you some signposts for other things to read, but let's jump right in. So the first criterion, really, Dawn teed this up wonderfully when she talked about the cost of voting index, for instance. This idea of inclusion. This is really the most fundamental question in a democracy is who's included, right? In our case, we think about who's excluded or removed from the electoral rolls. And more recently, we've paid better attention, as Dawn was suggesting, to variations in voter access. So questions of even being eligible are still relevant. The new law in Florida meant to re-enfranchise people with prior felony convictions is a great example of trying to make progress on that side. But the real action right now is on ease of access to registration and actual participation in elections. So that's, again, well addressed. But coming with that very quickly is democracy isn't just about inclusion, it's about inclusion for the exercise of power. So voting equality. And we don't tend to think about this as much, strangely, but when we talk about things like the Electoral College and district boundaries in the United States, we pretty quickly get into the math of actually votes have different weight, right? If you happen to live in one place, one particular district or one particular state, your vote actually carries more weight than other people's votes. So that inequity actually maps pretty well onto the map Dawn was showing you earlier of differences across the United States. So not only do we have differences in terms of voter participation and so on, but also differences in terms of the value of one's vote, the one person, one vote. So the next slide gives us the next pair of criteria. And for most of us, this rounds out our basic conception of democracy. Number 3, which gets forgotten sometimes, is the agenda, right? It's great that we're all included and we have voting equality, but what are we voting on, right? What is on the agenda? And policy sciences is a great field for this, looking at institutional roles in all this. But there is obviously a role for individual people to shape the agenda. So sometimes people who study deliberative democracy, for instance, will point out that to have a good deliberation first means to have the right issue in front of us. So things like kind of aggressive protest politics can be crucial for a deliberative democracy because they can be what changes what we're talking about. They can change the conversation. As we know with movements like Black Lives Matter most recently, you really see a potential change in what policy questions are even up for debate. The fourth criterion, as I said, kind of rounds out that first set of effective participation. And this is most of what people are talking about when they talk about civic engagement. Notice it's only one of 5 criteria, but it just couldn't be more important. It's who has and uses opportunities to express their voice about what is on the agenda. Ton of research on this. Dawn was pointing to some of it already. There's all sorts of determinants of who participates. And then it interacts with other institutional variables as to the impact it has. The last slide is that fifth criterion, and this is really what I've devoted my career to, and I know it's of interest to folks here at this conference. In fact, you'll have a deliberation exercise tomorrow. When we think about deliberative democracy, we have to assume those first four criteria are all being taken care of, and at that point we start asking, okay, what's going on when we talk? Everything from how we talk on the floor of Congress, to in committees, to at public meetings, to informal conversations, citizens talking with citizens. What's involved in that? How do we feel about evidence, right? Do we have some agreement on what counts as reliable information sources, reliable evidence? What's a reasoned argument? Right? What count as valid reasons? Do you have to appeal to reasons that are broadly understood, or can you make special appeals to people who might have particular theological or epistemological views? Honest personal testimony, empathy, and careful consideration are all really important to make sure that when we talk about deliberation, we're not just talking about some kind of abstract rationality. We're talking about testimony and concern and really hearing each other. So in a deliberative democracy, you not only have people participating and having voting power and having good issues on the agenda, but you also have a higher quality of talk filled with empathy and reason that helps us really make better decisions, both as individuals when we're deciding how to vote, but also as governing institutions, whether it's a jury empowered to make its own kind of decision, conventional government bodies, or new deliberative bodies designed specifically to transform democratic practice, things that are sometimes called mini publics, like the Oregon Citizens Initiative Review, where a small random sample of the public actually writes the one-page issue analysis that goes in the official voting guide. There's all kinds of creative ways of making the larger political system and even our smaller interactions more deliberative. So again, that broad overview is just meant to kind of get us thinking about the different aspects of a democracy. And when we think about civic engagement and public health, hopefully we can think of it from those different points of view to get a full sense of what it means to be a citizen in a truly democratic political system. Thank you.